it's just that one, and not touch anything else. Right, okay. I think a little bit about archaeology, and this actually took me backwards in time to things that I was thinking about many, many years ago, so it's been a pleasant exercise in intellectual memory. I wanted to start with really some moderately platitudinous statement, which is that archaeology is a practice which is inevitably rooted in its own social conditions. And that is obviously platitudinous, and we all know it. I'm interested in some of the things which have happened when we start thinking about archaeology as being so rooted, and about archaeologists as being so rooted. Now, one of the places that one can go, pretty obviously, is a subjectivity versus objectivity argument. Are archaeologists just making it up? But I don't want to go there, and I think that for reasons actually that Martin was touching on earlier, I don't think that's a fruitful way to think, and I think the best interpreters have avoided that very effectively. But nevertheless, regardless of that particular element, archaeology is a very political subject and a very politicised subject, and it always has been. And we need to be very conscious of that when we use archaeological evidence. Far more people use archaeological evidence than produce archaeological evidence, after all. So here we are, many of us in the course of today, using archaeological evidence, but that has come from practitioners who are in highly politicised contexts. It's also, although this has perhaps been stated less clearly than some of the other arguments, a discipline which is oddly, but nevertheless intimately connected with aesthetics. It produces some very interesting combinations. Not many of us think about the archaeological site as a piece of artistic production, but perhaps we could do a little bit more with thinking about it in those terms, both as observers and as participants. So some of those thoughts will come back. Archaeology as a concept does not have, archaeology as a kind of the digging stuff up, is not particularly old. As a concept and as a social practice of systematically unearthing the past, it's a late 19th century creation, invention, with specific heuristic implications. And it's therefore right that Freud is sitting here at his desk with the bits and pieces that are around him, because he's not that far away, actually, from the earlier practitioners in the 1860s and 1870s who were developing something that was distinctive as a quasi or actual science from the simple antiquarian finding and recording of things in a serendipitous way. But when Freud was contemplating what it was that he was doing, he uses archaeology as a metaphor. And I think that's interesting. The idea that you can take this stripping away, this systematic stripping away, to find something which has been hidden, but which is of contemporary relevance, is Freud's take on the more scientific descriptions by Flinders Petrie and others of what they thought they were doing. We'll come back in a moment to what the archaeologists thought they were about. I very quickly and very obviously just slide across a century or just less to Foucault. And Foucault's clear view that archaeology is about examining discursive traces and orders left by the past in order to write a history of the present. And this is very important, I think. It's not far away from what Freud was saying. The reason you are stripping down these layers is to get back at something which is relevant to you now. And from Freud to Foucault, in other words, from the observer, non-participant point of view, there's a clear history of archaeology in which the object of study is profoundly present. Profoundly, I mean that as a sort of intentional pun. It's deep. You have to go quite a long way to find it, but it is of contemporary significance. It's of significance to you as an observer. So there's a whole run of observers of archaeology who are finding it metaphorically significant. What are the archaeologists doing? There are, I think, at least two, obviously 20 million, but at least two ways of running the history of archaeology, and one is down a highly scientific line. In many ways, archaeology has situated itself for pragmatic as well as intellectual reasons as closer to science. It has done so because that's where the money was. It has done so because that's where prestige lay. You were in 1950s universities in America seeing the way that economists were suddenly taking over in the academy. It was a very good thing to go off and count stuff. And so you have a whole run of archaeologists called processual archaeologists who count things. They count as many things as they can. They're particularly good at counting flints. And at the end, you've got 1 million flints, and you do stats with them, and you say, look, you know, I'm a real person in the academy, and I deserve a pay rise. That line of scientific archaeology is a strong and very relevant one. Of course, it's taken some real strides forward, some of them with some of the biological paleobotanical work that we have been able to do, which takes us again back to previous papers that have touched on the deep past of the brain and so forth. But another way is for archaeology to situate itself very clearly alongside narrative and alongside aesthetics. And it's this part of archaeology that I just want to talk about very briefly, really largely just to have a bit of fun and see where we go. So, Queen Puabi and the murder at Mesopotamia. In the 1920s and the 1930s, one of the great missions, archaeological missions, was Leonard Woolley at Ur in southern Iraq. We heard a little while ago about clay bricks. Well, here they are in abundance. We're a long way back here. We're thousands of years BC. And Leonard Woolley was digging away. You see him at the top with his wife, Catherine Woolley. And also Max Mallowan. Max Mallowan, as many of you will know, was Agatha Christie's husband. What they found is this extraordinary tomb down here, which is the royal tomb of Queen Puabi. As far as we can know, she died about 40 years old in age. She was about 5 foot high, just under. There's an inscription on one of the cylinder seals, which is how we know who she is. And it's possible that she was her queen in her own right. That's what we think now, because there's no reference to a male, and usually Mesopotamian women are related to a male. So the fact there isn't a male referred to could mean that she's a queen in her own right. She's buried about 2600 BC. She's got a fantastic set of stuff buried with her, items from what is quaintly described sometimes as Puabi's dressing table, including her cosmetics. We have the lid of a rather poorly preserved silver box which contained coal, black pigment used to highlight eyes. We have a whole range of jewellery. We also have 52 attendants who have been ritually killed. Their bodies were contorted into unnatural positions to imitate lying on each other's laps peacefully, sometimes oriented to hide the bit of the skull that had been smashed in. And we have helmets and headdresses placed on the head, suggesting they may have been killed outside the tombs, dressed, laid out, and then brought in with Puabi. Now, what the interesting things is that Woolley and others thought that it was inconceivable that Puabi could be a queen in her own right, so she must have been killed with her attendants on the death of the king. So there was much concern over finding trauma on Puabi's head. So one part of the Puabi story is a great mystery. A mystery which led Agatha Christie to be so inspired to write a novel, which was actually about somebody murdering Catherine Woolley, Leonard Woolley's wife, who Agatha Christie passionately loathed. But the other side of this story was Puabi's fantastic headdress. This magnificent gold headdress, which had come out of the ground and was looking so absolutely magnificent. So a lot of the press at the time is all about the reconstruction of a story, a narrative, an aesthetic of this Mesopotamian queen, with her makeup, her dressing table, her clothes, her reconstructed headdress. What's interesting is how many varying inspirations were given rise to by this single set of material. And you can see some early representations on the far left, somebody wearing a version of the jewellery, actually in the 1940s, 1944, could be much more modern, given some of our Hollywood reconstructions, and then the very depersonalised reproductions that we see more in the contemporary at the far left and on this side here. So we've got an interesting attempt to take Puabi out of her headdress. And some of the most interesting modern interpretations of the Puabi burial now are focused very much not on Puabi, but on her gold, and on the way in which the gold was actually produced. It's hammered. And there's a lot of work about the repetitive nature of this hammering, what hammering the gold actually meant, what sheen, what gleam it gives to the metal by the repeated hammering, then annealing and rehammering and then re-annealing. So that it's the jewellery which is actually taking much more of the weight of the story instead of our traumatized queen. There's also an interesting issue of seamlessness. These pieces of gold are seamless. They're not welded, they're not put together, they are single pieces. And people have got very excited about ways in which you could actually interpret something that is shiny, that is produced by repetition, and which is seamless in a world which emphasizes, it appears, stability and political continuity, even though those were values that were actually quite difficult to instantiate in reality, was a world that emphasized its continuity. So there's some very interesting shifts that have happened in Puabi's life as an object, as an entity, winding up in an Institute for the Study of the Ancient World exhibition called From Ancient to Modern Archaeology and Aesthetics. It's not a unique story. You can do exactly the same, actually, with the treasures from Mycenae that Schliemann dug up, and at the risk of overrunning my time, these were lost. And the story goes that they were discovered by a wonderful archaeologist called Brian Shefton, who was one of the clumsiest men on the planet, when he went off to try and find the loo in the Hermitage in a conference and walked into the wrong cupboard, and these things fell out to be recovered. That at least is Brian's story. But there are interesting other ways in which this aesthetic moment of Ur has been reconfigured in the contemporary. The very old statue on the far side is imitated by an artist called Michael Rakovitz, who has Iraqi Jewish identity, and he has reconstructed the statue out of throwaway objects, found objects, saying something about the loss of almost much of this material through the vicissitudes of the past 20-odd years in this terribly fraught area. So the statue, the person of Quabi seems to have disappeared a little bit back, and the object has come a little forwards. And I just wanted to finish on this particular note by pointing out that one of the things that is interesting about the ICAW exhibition was that it had gone so far about trying to take away the story of Puabi that it had actually up-fronted the story of Woolley, Malawan and Christie, so that the objects were situated in the exhibition alongside archival material, letters, pictures, documentaries, notebooks, field records, press clippings, publications, and modern and contemporary works of art, a little bit like the archive which we heard about a little bit earlier. In the ISAW presentation, the conclusion is made that these documents show how the archaeological find has been received and promoted, okay, and allowed the find to become a work of art, illuminated the way that an archaeological object has been transfigured into an aesthetic object and stand as proof that this transubstantiation has taken place. I'm not absolutely convinced by that, but I think it's a very interesting idea, so maybe we can talk about it later. My other case study is based on a book which I guess many of you will know, Kitty House's Shadow Sites, which is an extraordinarily beautiful account of the way in which archaeology contributed to the development of the neo-romanticist movement in England in the 20s and 30s. The story really starts with the pioneer of aerial photography, O.G.S. Crawford, universally known as Bloody Crawford, because he was bloody difficult, bloody minded, and bloody awkward. He was a tough, hard, difficult, radical outsider who was only really happy when he was up in the skies. He was the pioneer, after experience in the First World War, of taking these wonderful aerial photographs in raking light that were able to reveal the landscape that was completely unknown. Nobody had seen this kind of stuff before. Nobody had taken advantage until really in the First World War and just after of what was going on in the landscape and could be recovered very, very simply. What's interesting about Crawford is that through his life, he actually saw no difference between his work on a prehistoric landscape and his photography of slogans near Chalk Farm, King Henry's Road. He was a photographer of everything that he could see. He saw human history as being a continuum. I talked a lot about eruptions and short circuits. Crawford was a great believer in the deep continuity of history. He expounded this very poorly. You do not go and read Crawford. He was a scientific archaeologist. What he did do, however, was create a journal called Antiquity. And Antiquity was the go-to book. It was the go-to journal for almost anybody in the neo-romanticist movement. Piper had a beautifully bound copy of Antiquity. All of his chums, all of the circle of John and the family Piper were reading Antiquity as it came out because of the aerial photography, because of the pictures that were coming through, and the influence is extraordinary. This is Piper in another groundbreaking journal of its time, Axis, 1937, with this extraordinary composition, another montage, in which he has something by Stukely, the great antiquarian, an aerial photograph from the school of Crawford, and a mural painting, put together on the same page with an argument about some kind of formal similarity going on, and at precisely the same time, Hepworth who spent time at the British School at Rome, produced Icon in 1937. It wasn't cast in this form until much later. So we've got some really interesting crossovers, and we can just simply keep running these pictures, these Neoromanticist pictures, which have become so much more visible now after a long period when nobody looked at this kind of stuff, with the Dulwich Gallery, Ruvilius exhibition and so forth. Suddenly this is all back in fashion. Nash, Landscape of the Megaliths, 1937 again. Piper, Avebury, with the only feature of the modern world is that this column that's actually part of the modern landscape of Avebury. Ruvilius's interesting Wilmington giant, very interesting in part because Wilmington reverses, as you see from the aerial photograph, and there are contemporary aerial photographs, reverses the white and black. It's interesting because during the war, the Wilmington giant was blacked out. The chalk was covered so that it didn't give a landmark. And of course the transmutation of the fascination with aerial photography into something rather different. The Monington is up there just to remind us that Monington was a BSR award holder as well. And then of course Nash. Now that world sits alongside quite comfortably the world of photography, Piper and Brandt, who are combining a sort of archaeology. This is a different kind of archaeology. It's the archaeology of objects and the archaeology of building, and the archaeology of things left in buildings. Brandt was very good at taking pictures with cathedrals with the ladders still standing up. And the archaeology of the standing structure takes directly back to prehistory. Really interesting combinations here. Crawford photographing Stonehenge on the ground. Down below a wall, a field wall in the Netherlands, I think, and up above Piper photographing church walls for architectural review, and then in time transmuting them. I'll finish off with Piper's Avebury Restored, this kind of strange 1944 work in which, as with others of its time, there's a collapse between antiquity and the present. And it's a collapse between antiquity and present which was being actively encouraged by some readings of archaeology. If you look at what Crawford was trying to say, and also what Grigson, who was a very significant figure who worked alongside Crawford, but from the literary point of view, there's a huge argument that is underpinning all this about the redemptive fragment, about the way the fragment redeems, about the way that discovering this antiquity is actually part of the way of linking England back to an earlier England, all at a time of profound social and political conflict and change. I'm not in any way holding a candle for Neoromanticism here. I'm simply saying that at this particular point in time, the combination of archaeology, which was being written with a particular sort of narrative, was picked up and then reinforced by artists and writers who were operating in the same sorts of ways. And a lot of it was in reaction to what was seen as encroachments on the landscape that were damaging to archaeology and potentially thought to be more spiritually damaging. And I think I'll just conclude with this section by just pointing out that for many, that one of the things that has become increasingly clear is that this combination between photography and archaeology and artistic representation in archaeology is not something that was born in the 1930s. What we can see, if we look hard, is that both archaeology and photography emerge almost at the same time and under similar kinds of interests in the middle of the 19th century. And there are some very interesting combinations that one play. Now, so we've had archaeology as a sort of metaphor. We've had archaeology as some sort of redemptive performance. And what I want to turn to now is what I think some modern archaeologists would like to argue, which is that archaeology is a métier, that archaeology is a craft, turning back to that aesthetic production of archaeology. This very much arises from the work of three scholars, really, Shanks and Tilley and Ian Hodder. My guess is that everybody, many of you know, Reconstructing Archaeology, Theory and Practice, sometimes described as the Black Book. Reconstructing Archaeology, Theory and Practice was published in 1987. The second edition came out in 1992. It was one of archaeology is a pretty staid subject in some respects. People don't tend to get up and walk out on other people. I think Angela just walked out on me. Never mind. Here are some of the reactions and criticisms. This is what people said, right? This is what people said about reconstructing archaeologists. They described the authors as messianic propagandists purveying pretentious irrelevancies and extremist pedantry, playing sceptical and cant-like word games, deliberately misrepresenting in fallacious, illogical and inconsistent rhetoric, verging on exuberant intellectual dishonesty. That was quoted by Shanks and Tilley in what's an absolutely typical bit of naughty boy behaviour. Shanks and Tilley were the bad boys of archaeology. They strutted the stages in Cambridge and the world for a few years with reconstructing archaeology as a manifesto for doing things in a completely different way. They were angry. They were very angry. And listen to the context in which they were writing. Right, so this is 1987. The shadows of the present crisis loom over us, they said. Educational cutbacks, the Philistine assaults of the new right, populist imagery of a conflict-free heritage, visions of solidarity cloaked in mythical images, or of conflict diffused by scientific understanding. So that's what they were facing in 1987. Here we are so much further on in 2015. Humph. This attempt to create a critically self-conscious archaeology was highly theoretical, but also stepped very much into the world of the museum, where they presciently asked for the object to come out from the case and into the community, something which many museums have tried to do. I'll give you just a quick example of why Shanks and Tilley annoyed archaeologists, the rest of the archaeological community so much. Two caricatures of an archaeologist, right? One is they count stuff. We just did that, count stuff. The other is they drink a lot of beer in Cambridge. So what do the two bad boys of Cambridge archaeology do? They do a detailed statistical analysis with stochastic logarithms and algorithms of beer cans and their imagery in the Netherlands and in Britain. And it's enraged everybody who wasn't actually prepared to think that it was just an incredibly clever thing to do. It enraged them even more because they actually produced some really interesting research about ways in which different countries presented both the attractions and the dangers of alcohol, different ways of advertising. What I find so absolutely fascinating going back to this is how it suddenly turned into its own little archive museum piece of its own. McEwan's Best Scotch first-class return, with their analysis underneath of how you'll get your first-class return from England, where the beer is horrid, back to the real stuff, McEwan's Best Scotch, which is unfortunately in Newcastle. But also these extraordinary adverts. You may be able to read here, the Dutch version. This is Prick, a beer which has memories, stirs memories. What do you remember? Remember tankards of pots in grain, and barrels, and so on and so forth. we remember this is why we brew Prip. So that's what the Dutch are doing. Meanwhile, in Newcastle, in the 1980s, that's what you do. So it's a very interesting subject. It annoyed everybody like crazy, but it's now dated interestingly through the shifts that we've seen. So it's become an archaeological object in and of itself. Now, one of the interesting other aspects of what Shanks and Tilly were trying to do was to depoliticize archaeology by trying to take it away from being the preserve of the posh archaeologist, the powerful archaeologist, the Leonard Woolley dictator on the site kind of archaeologist. And what they wanted to do was transfer interpretation to the trowel's edge. This is one of Hodder's most iconic phrases. So that instead of you've got this very hierarchical world in archaeology, somebody digs, puts it on a piece of on a tray, and somebody else comes along and says, "Oh, well, that's what it means." They were trying to say that the person who dug it up at the trowel's edge should be immediately interpreting and be part of the hermeneutic process. I found it very interesting to discover this blast back in the 1990s to Hodder, pointing out that the whole problem with being at the trowel's edge is that somebody else has already decided the nature of your trowel and the place that you're digging, and that you're conforming to constraints of time pressure, finances devised by those to whom archaeology is kin to the removal of toxic waste. This is back to waste. This is a problem of preventive archaeology, when the problem about archaeology is it's getting in the way of you building a housing estate. So archaeology becomes toxic waste, and the archaeology is just the remover of toxic waste. There's no chance in this to be hermeneutically exploring at the trowel's edge, and there is no objectivity that is to be obtained. I find it equally interesting that this is in itself a kind of archaeological fragment. It's a draft of an unfinished and abandoned paper, which has started and never quite finished, like something just left to be found. So where is this taking us now? Where are we headed to? What's next? I think at the moment we're very, very interested in practice, archaeology as practice. We're very interested in perhaps some of the short circuits which we were talking about a little earlier. There's a sense in which archaeology, instead of justifying itself through science or through narrative or through aesthetics, is really trying to position itself as a political discipline with contemporary relevance and trying to squeeze every chunk of comparative value from the archaeological activity. But that comes with risks and with challenges. One of the things that archaeologists are very keen to do is to talk about practice, decentering the mind, decentering text, decentering conversation, and shifting very much to the centre bodily movements, things, practical knowledge, and routine. Archaeologists are very much more interested in process now, perhaps, than they are in people. And that gives a totally different approach to the site and to the explanation of the site. So this is a Shanks photo in which there is a wheelbarrow but nobody to push it. We're also extremely interested in the agency of the object. This very, very intriguing idea that these things in their own time and possibly subsequently are exactly the kinds of cultural prosthetics and external hard drive, mental hard drives that Martin's talked about, that they have their own agency. And that goes with some very interesting work that tries to take the body and disperse it, so that the limit of the body goes a long way away from the human being. You start seeing this in work particularly on burial, mortuary practice, where the body is dissected and dispersed but continues to have identity and force, somewhat like a relic, perhaps. And this is all very, very interesting, and I suspect we've got lots more twists and turns in this narrative. However, all of this is, of course, highly reflective of its own circumstances. It's very interesting that as we economically find we have less money, we spend much more time not digging and virtually reconstructing because it's cheaper and takes fewer people. It's very interesting, it seems to me, that we've got quite interested in the idea of the agency of the object and the fragment at this particular juncture, in which holes with a W can be quite threatening. It's quite interesting that we're trying to find ways of representing through small things larger patterns. But this goes far beyond any debate about subjectivity and objectivity. What we are finding is inevitably a representation. It's not the real site. The real site is gone, even if it ever existed. We're only finding representations of the past. And they're all of them, to some extent, somewhere on a line between being fictional or mendacious, depending on how critical one wants to be of archaeology as a social practice and on what use archaeology is being put to. Archaeology in that regard is no different from history, and the uses to which history can be put can be benign, or, as sadly we seem to have seen today in rather desperate events in Tunisia, Kuwait and France, can be turned to very malign purposes. Thank you very much.